The Russian Kupyansk offensive is in full effect as they are storming the settlements and fortifications of the Ukrainians northeast of the city from several directions. The Russians managed to gain control over the fortifications on the outskirts of Kupyansk. This allowed them to start pushing to the north of the TO504 highway to cover the northern flank of the highway for a stable supply line into the city and to bypass the fortifications of the Ukrainians by attacking them from their weak spot, which is from the southern flank, allowing them to attack them one at a time rather than a full frontal assault directly facing all of these defensive fortifications. The Russians are advancing alongside the highway itself in the northern direction from the outskirts of Chasiv Yar to regain full control over the city and to start pushing into Mykolaiivka, Chervone and Podilske here on the western flank of Chasiv Yar. At the same time, following the capture of the fortifications outside of Maiske, they are now pushing in the western direction towards the town of Viruliobivka, gaining control over some of the fortifications and forest lines leading up to the town, and an entry into it where fighting is now taking place within it. The Russians are here advancing on numerous sections of the front line in a new offensive that started just 2 days ago, and this follows the Ukrainian counterattacks in the direction of Huliaipole and in the Kupyansk direction, where they are attempting to reverse the situation. The Ukrainians send reinforcements to these areas of the front line, and this, as I have previously reported on, the tactic of the Russians is whenever the Ukrainians counterattack and makes it difficult for them to advance in areas they have an offensive, well, they spread out to attack other sectors of the front line. They've already captured Pokrovsk and encircled Mirnarad. That means they won't be launching any offensive there anytime soon until they consolidate their positions within Pokrovsk and gain full control over Mirnarad to then push beyond it. But in other sectors, such as the Chasiv Yar section, the Russians haven't been launching any active offensives for a very long time. Ever since the capture of the city, they've been on the defensive, because at that time, the Ukrainians were counterattacking there. Now that the Ukrainians have redirected their forces elsewhere, well, the Russians continued offensive operations in other sectors of the front line and are now launching the new offensive near Chasiv Yar. Throughout this update, the Russians have advanced to the south of Vovchansk in the direction of Vilja, in the Kupyansk direction on the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line, while the Ukrainians continued offensive operations to regain control over Kupyansk from the east and from the south. The Russians advanced along the Serebet river line here along the eastern flank of Liman, as well as in the Chasiv Yar section of the front line near Kupyansk, north of Pokrovsk in the direction of Dubropilya, and in the southern section of the front line near Stepnohirsk. Starting out in the Kupyansk direction, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the TO504 highway. However, the northern flank is still exposed to the Ukrainian fortifications just north of the highway itself. This also explains the reveal of the fortifications and trenches in the area. It is clear that the Russians have advanced alongside these trenches, and that is why they have been revealed on Google Maps. These trenches and fortifications all alongside the southern flank of Chervone and Podilske, as well as to the north of them, they have all been revealed, while to the northwestern direction of Stinky and the surrounding settlements, the fortifications have yet to be revealed. So this shows that the Russians are actively fighting over this area here along Podilske in the north and down towards the TO504 highway to the south, Chasiv Yar to the east, and then it stops to the west. Someone asked in the comments yesterday, well, Google Maps doesn't really have an impact because both the Russians and the Ukrainians already have the up-to-date satellite imagery. Well, if it didn't matter, then why are they not updating live? Why have they not updated since the start of the war? Much of these fortifications have not been shown because they were built after the war started, but the satellite imagery has not been updated since. Why are they suddenly updating it while fighting is taking place in the area? Well, clearly because it has an impact. For instance, it increases the flexibility of the officers commanding at the front line if they're able to check the updated mapping from Google Maps. The ones who do not have access to the satellite imagery from either side, well, they're able to check on their phones at this point. And these are areas where they are exactly at the front line, whether it is an escape route or a flanking route or whatever it is, it at least has somewhat of an impact. The Russian advances on the outskirts of Chasiv Yar aligns the front line with the river line and then pushes into the western outskirts of the residential area. The Russians are here working on gaining full control over the exact area that is revealed on the satellite imagery, gaining control of these fortifications with a buffer zone outside of Chasiv Yar, and with the push in the direction of Viruliobivka here further north, The Russians are looking to align the front line with the railway to bypass additional fortifications. It is clear that the fortifications are all facing in the eastern direction, near Stinky in the northeast, as well as onwards to defend the Sloviansk-Chasiv defensive line. This means a Russian push from the south, as we're seeing from along the highway, to gain control over the fortifications here near Chasiv itself, and the settlements is flanking them from their weak spot, and they can continue doing so onwards from the flank of Kupyansk, continuing alongside these fortifications and trenches, attacking them from their flank and attacking their weak spot. However, we see here that some of these fortifications are actually facing in the southeastern direction. This is to prevent a push from this southern direction, and that is why we are seeing the push from the north. This is to bypass these fortifications and attack them from the weak spot again, and this is to completely cover the northern flank of Kupyansk, gaining control over the city itself by pushing from the TO504 highway in the east, the highway to the south in the direction of Tursk, and from the southeastern roads and railway lines leading into the city, where Russians have control over all three. They need to cover the flanks to secure the supply route leading into the city, from where they can expand offensive operations to gain control over important areas such as the apartment complex areas and industrial zones. To the southwest of this, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Dorishne and Ivanivka, gaining control over the western flank along the forest lines, pushing up in the direction of Dobropilya, and gaining control over portions of Ivanivka as they are attacking Novosharov in the northeast and Ivanivka in the south, to gain control over the northern flank of Nikonarivka and Dorishne. With the capture of the possessions east of the defensive line here east of Belitske, the Russians are now developing offensive operations towards the city to attack on the southern and northern directions. To the southwest of this, the Russians continued offensive operations within the Zaporizhia region, gaining control over the western parts of Stepova, the forest lines around it, and the southern flank of the defensive line, where they're looking to gain full control over the areas north of these fortifications and trenches, as well as the settlements, where they are looking to establish positions for when they push from the western direction, from the Stepnohirsk direction along the fortifications. They're able to support their forces by advancing from the southern flank of the fortifications, not to attack the fortifications themselves, but to prevent Ukrainian counterattacks from cutting off the supplies. By having control of the southern flank, they're able to resupply on a wider front and keep their forces going with reinforcements and logistics, meeting up with them as they advance alongside the fortifications. In the northeastern flank of Kupyansk, the Russians continued advances along the Sherebets river line, where they managed to gain control over the forest lines and forest patches west of Novodiane along the river line itself. The Russians are here working to establish their possessions on the western bank and continue offensive operations in the direction of Borova and this section of the front line, gain control over the river itself, and everything west of it is an attempt to widen the positions of the Ukrainians, attacking them from multiple sectors and putting a lot of pressure on them, while the Battle of Kupyansk continues to prevent the Ukrainians from dedicating all of their forces in one area. As they continue their offensive operations, gain control over the southern residential areas. The southern street is now under Ukrainian control. The western flank is also being stormed by their forces, and to the southeast as well. In the northwestern positions, the Ukrainians also managed to regain control over some residential buildings here in the western parts of it. So far, they haven't yet to gain control over any of the important stronghold areas, such as the southern apartment complex area, southeastern school, the central industrial area, the railway station, the apartment complex buildings in the eastern and northern portion of the city. However, they are threatening the supply lines going into the city in the northern flank, and they're looking to cut off their positions in the southern flank as well. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are looking to cut off the northern highway and the northern supply routes leading into the city to cut off the connection in the western bank of the Uskar river line, but they're also looking to cut off the road connection between the eastern and western parts of Kupyansk. By gaining control over this intersection in the central parts and the supply lines in the north, even if the Russians gain full control over Kupyansk and the highway leading up to the city, they will not be able to properly resupply the western parts of it. Therefore, the Russians are putting everything they have to defend these two areas to prevent a Ukrainian recapture of the city and defending these areas. However, they do not have a lot of supplies and a lot of forces within the city. The best they can do is to hold the central positions along the apartment complex areas and the well-defensible positions, which the Ukrainians have to clear by going from building to building, clearing every single one of them, until they gain control over the eastern flank, where the Russians have managed to gain control over the central parts of Petropavlivka. They're pushing through from the eastern and northern flanks to gain control over the highway. They are getting close to it, but the Ukrainians are also getting close to cutting off the supplies in Kupyansk. This is a very tight battle between the Russians and the Ukrainians over who gains control over the logistics and supply lines first. If the Russians gain control over the highway area, the Russians will be able to resupply their forces within Kupyansk and reverse the Ukrainian counterattack. If the Ukrainians gain control of it first, then even if the Russians gain control over the highway connection, they'll be able to encircle the Russian forces within Kupyansk and cut off all of their supply lines. However, an interesting part is the fact that the Ukrainians have yet to capture any of the well-defensible areas. What this means is, if the Russians are able to gain control over the highway, and even if the Ukrainians cut off the supply lines, well, the Russians will be able to strike the Ukrainian positions throughout the city, avoiding the Russian positions in the well-defensible areas, heavily hammering the Ukrainian positions with artillery, drones, FAB bombs, and so on. Could inflict a lot of casualties on the Ukrainians, as they do not have control of these apartment complex areas and industrial areas which can defend them against these strikes. That means as long as the Russians are able to hold on to these well-defensible areas and have good logistics for their long-range strike capabilities, and can resupply the forces with drones or hold out for a couple of weeks, then the Ukrainians will not be able to properly establish themselves within the city without capturing these well-defensible areas. That is why the Russians, when they capture a city, they always go for these apartment complex buildings, because they defend against these larger strikes. But if the Ukrainians are unable to capture them, then they will not be able to hold on to the encirclement of the city. If we play out the scenario, let's say Ukraine cuts off the logistics in the north, and they manage to gain control over the central parts, including the industrial area. The Russians, in turn, gain control over the highway leading up to Kupyansk. In this case, the Russians are now ready to resupply their forces, but it has been cut off. What they can do is that they target their fire throughout the city with artillery on all of the residential buildings they detect the Ukrainian forces at. As for the industrial area, mall area, and the central parts of the city, well, the Russians can strike it with FAB bombs. This will heavily demolish the Ukrainian positions and allow them to counterattack, whether from the northern flank, the eastern flank, both, and the forces already within the city. If the Ukrainians in turn manage to regain control over the southern portion, including the apartment complex buildings, the school area, the industrial area, and push into the industrial buildings and apartment complex buildings in the northern section, well, the Russians at best would need to withdraw from the city. At worst, they'll be encircled and lose much of their forces within it. However, we see that they would need a lot of time to do so, and the Russians are able to establish themselves along the eastern flank, which makes such a scenario unrealistic because the Russians simply will not allow it. That is why this is a very risky operation, because the Russians are militarily very capable in the area. Despite the low logistics within the city allowing the Ukrainians to counterattack and re-enter it, it is difficult for them to actually gain control over the core areas, such as the apartment complex buildings. In the northern flank in the direction of Kupyansk, the Russians push into Vilcha and gain control over the eastern railway line leading up to the town from the eastern flank, allowing for additional supply lines leading into it as they continue offensive operations to gain full control over it. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.